Iron League, or Iron Leaguer, Ship Iron Leaguer? There's like 3 or 4 different translations for this name. We'll go with Iron League because that's what my equipment identified it as when I plugged it in. Anyway, Iron League is, I think, a licensed tie-in platformer on the Game Boy. It's a little bit weird like that, and it's the last of the 3 import games from the half dozen or so I've been trying to get for about a year now. As I understand, this is a tie-in with an old school anime manga series from, I want to say, the 80s or so. I've genuinely never heard of this, but when I looked this game up originally, all I could find were like VHS copies of this and other tie-in merchandise, so yeah. The idea itself is you play one of several robotic sportball players platforming it up, defeating enemies, and gaining their powers in an almost sort of Mega Man-esque fashion, as well as showing up your opponents on the court, /field, /pitch, /whatever, to prove that you are, in fact, the most baller robot sportball player of all time. Now, the platforming in this game is relatively simple. You run to the left, you run to the right, you jump with A button, and you use your attacks with the B button. And the controls are fairly basic, as are the standard level designs. For the most part, it's just running to the right. Occasionally you'll be running to the left, but the level designs themselves are fairly basic and plain. What is interesting about the level designs themselves, however, is the fact that at times you'll run into areas that are basically just complete barricades that you cannot pass. And this is where things get a little bit interesting with this game, because you're not just controlling your one character, you're controlling a team of different robot sportball players. So you start with your baseball guy that just throws baseballs and that's about it. You can get a karate guy who can do his best shoryuken to destroy blocks on top of him. You can get a football guy who can teleport forward, basically. There's a basketball guy who jumps really, really high. Really being creative with that one, guys. And of course, you've got the almighty kendo guy who has the ability to stick his shinai in a wall to climb it in a rather sort of roundabout fashion. Now, I know what you're kind of thinking, though. Because these characters have exact specific powers that are required to progress through the levels, what happens if they die? Well, here's the interesting thing about that, because while every character on your team has their own individual health bar, you can also go through the team manager and reset your character's health bars. So like, say you need to jump really high with the basketball player, but you got him killed. You can go to your team stats, go to like your baseball guy or whatever, reduce his health to 0, and then give the basketball player all of your health. And then you can get past that. And to be fair, there's a few open-ended sort of blockades where you can use one of 2 or 3 different characters to get around those puzzles that way. But when you run into a pure blockade that requires one and only one character's powers, you can also just swap the health. And I think that's genuinely really cool, especially if there's one character that you like over all the rest, just in terms of basic platforming. Because they all have slightly different response times and attacks, one might resonate better with you just to get around than the others. And because of that, being able to reallocate health to them means that you can stick with the character you like as opposed to swapping to a character you're really not particularly good with. That's actually really cool. Now, in addition to the standard platforming stages, there are also sports stages. 3 different challenges that will be given to you as you progress through the game. The first one being a sort of almost Pong-esque batting cage fight of sorts, where this enemy guy throws a curving baseball at you at varying speeds, and you have to hit it back at him. Now, this level in particular, I had a lot of trouble with. In fact, half the time I spent recording footage was on this level, and that's because the speed at which he throws his curving throw, as well as the angle it hits you, as well as the angle that you can hit it back at him, are all random, and you have to hit him 3 times with this. So while I could fairly consistently make 1 or 2 hits on him, getting all 3 was a real challenge, as well as the fact that if you get hit by that ball, it takes about a quarter of your health. And there's a delay with your swing, and that's a little bit rough. On the bright side, the second and third challenges are much easier. The second one being a standard 2D platforming basketball game. Basically, they take the platforming aspects, put a little hoop and enemy in the background to block your shots, and you have to time the shot, as well as keep the enemy out of the way of the basket. Very simple, but it works really effectively, and I gotta say, this was a really creative use of the mechanics this game had. I was quite impressed with that. especially combining the foreground and background mechanics. That was really cool. But unfortunately, you don't see anything quite like this anywhere else in the game. And the last challenge you get is this top-down football game where you have to score 3 goals on your opponent. This is actually kind of both really hard and really easy, because the moment you bring up the opponent's goal on screen, the enemy goalie will basically be on top of you and it's almost impossible to shoot past him and he will rush you. But if you shoot it just before the goal will actually show up on screen, you won't trigger the enemy goalie and you can basically get free shots for days. Basically, this challenge is ridiculously easy if you make it that way and almost impossible if you don't. So these little challenge modes are kind of sort of in between in terms of difficulty. You can either get ones that are completely random or ridiculously hard, or you can get that one that's just really clever use of mechanics, and it's just a shame that it's sort of all over the place in terms of how these challenges were ultimately implemented, because there's definitely a lot of creativity, at least with one of these, and the inclusion of Sportsball, which I assume is some connection to the source material, is rather creatively done. I mean, I would love to have seen more use of platforming meets sports ball sort of challenges like this, but way better implemented. So while they were ultimately fun, they just weren't well designed, and that's the biggest shame of all, because the premise and the creativity is definitely there, just needs to be refined a little bit more. And finally, we have the boss fights. Now, this game is very much like Mega Man in the sense that when you defeat an enemy, you gain their power, although in this game you get the enemy on your team. But the boss fights themselves aren't even really boss fights. They're more like an exhibition of what the character you're about to get can do. And I say that because, given the fact that you, from the start, have 2 playable characters, and every time you beat a boss you're going to get another one on your team, you can literally just stand in your opponent and just hammer the attack button and take them out without really worrying about gaming over, because you have progressively more and more health just based on the fact that you have more and more characters that each have their own health bar. So the boss fights aren't even really that, because there's no challenge to them. And I also say that these are just sort of exhibitions about what your new character can do, in the sense that in the level after you receive your new character, their ability is basically required to get past a barricade or 2. Basically, at the end of the day, the main platforming works, although it's not terribly special. The boss fights are basically non-existent because of the inherent team mechanics of the game, and the challenges, while creative, aren't well implemented for the most part. And really, that's the biggest shame about all of this, is it definitely feels like there's a lot of cool ideas here, and the game is totally playable, but it feels like it could be just so much more if they just buckled down and put in a little bit more time and effort to really knock out those mechanics and put a little more effort into those level designs. But overall, it is a decent game. The overall presentation to Iron League is, you know what, it's pretty good. I think some of the sprites look a little bit similar. Case in point, I think the basketball and karate guy look basically identical, and I think a lot of the enemy sprites look identical as well. But that said, the sprites are well detailed and they're genuinely cool looking. The environments themselves, they're not terribly special. You got your standard building, ice, forest worlds. They're nothing special, but they work for what they need to do. But where this game really excels is the soundtrack, because this game has an amazing soundtrack. Seriously, when I turned this game on for the first time and I hit record, I sat there on the title screen for about 5 minutes just recording the music because it was that damn catchy. So, rock on, Iron Leaguer, you're awesome. Now, if you want to get a copy of Iron League on the Game Boy, finding a copy is probably going to be your biggest issue. I've only seen 3 copies on eBay ever, hence why it's taken me this long to get a copy myself, but each copy only sat at about $10, so I don't know if they're rare, but if they are, people aren't charging like they are. They're just not easy to come by. That said, if you're patient enough to find a copy of Iron Leaguer, you are in for a treat in terms of really damn catchy music, some fun mechanics, and some creative choices based on Sportball robots. And that is genuinely the most enthusiastic I'm ever going to be about Sportball. Seriously, you have got to put some kind of twist on sports to make me care. And Sportball platforming robots with a kick-ass soundtrack? Hell yes.